The battle begins. I always knew that dealing with an HOA was a nightmare, but I never expected them to try to take my land. My name is Jake Turner, and I own a farm on the outskirts of a growing town. My grandfather bought this land decades ago, long before the fancy suburban neighborhoods popped up around it. He worked hard to build a life here, and I followed in his footsteps, making a living raising cattle, growing crops, and running a small dairy business. Everything was running smoothly, until the HOA decided they wanted to claim my property as part of their jurisdiction. It started with a letter in my mailbox, a very official-looking document from the Greenwood Estates Homeowners Association, a name that sounded way too important for a bunch of people who spent their days arguing about lawn heights and fence colors. The letter stated that my property was now under HOA regulation and that I needed to comply with their rules, including paying monthly fees, submitting landscaping plans, and getting community approval for any changes I made to my own land. I laughed at first. It was ridiculous. My farm was not in their neighborhood. I had never signed anything agreeing to their authority. And more importantly, my deed and legal records proved that my property was not within HOA boundaries. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it in the trash, thinking that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A rude awakening. The next morning, I got up early, as usual, ready to start my day. Running a farm isn't a job where you get to sleep in. The cows don't care if you're tired. They need milking. The crops don't care if you're busy. They need tending. So, with a cup of coffee in hand, I stepped outside, ready to get to work. But something was wrong. I saw a cluster of cars parked near the entrance to my property. Not just any cars, official-looking SUVs with HOA stickers on the sides. And standing there, arms crossed, was her. The woman who would become my biggest nightmare. Her name was Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed dictator of Greenwood Estates. She was the type of person who thought she was above the law simply because she had a clipboard, a set of unnecessary rules, and an inflated sense of self-importance. With her was a group of HOA board members, dressed in their usual business casual attire, button-down shirts, and judgmental expressions. And to my surprise, there were police officers standing alongside them. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who likes trouble, but when I saw cops standing on my land, blocking my entrance, I knew this was more than just a misunderstanding. I walked toward them, keeping my tone even. "Morning. What's going on here?" Karen turned to me with a smug smile. "Good morning, Mr. Turner. We're here on official HOA business. Your property has been reclassified as part of Greenwood Estates, and until you comply with community standards, we can't allow unauthorized access." I blinked. Unauthorized access. "This is my farm," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "I own this land. I have a deed proving that it's not part of your HOA." Karen didn't even flinch. She simply adjusted her oversized sunglasses and handed me a printed document. "We recently updated our community boundaries. According to our new regulations, your property is subject to revaluation. Until that process is complete, you cannot use this road without HOA authorization." I scanned the paper. It was full of legal jargon, but I caught the key phrases: pending review, temporary restrictions, and mandatory compliance. I looked up at her. "This is a joke, right? You can't just decide my land belongs to the HOA." She shrugged. "The community has spoken. The police get involved." Now, if it had just been HOA members standing there, I would have told them to get off my land and gone about my day. But the police were standing with them, looking all too serious. One of the officers stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Sir, we need you to provide identification and proof of property ownership." I narrowed my eyes. "Are you serious?" The cop nodded. I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept my temper in check. Arguing with a police officer never ends well, and I needed to handle this the right way. So I walked back to my house, grabbed my property deed, and returned. I handed it to the officer. "Here, this proves that I own this land. The HOA has no legal right to restrict access. The officer took the paper and examined it. Meanwhile, Karen spoke again, her voice dripping with condescension. You need to understand, Mr. Turner, that HOAs have the right to enforce community standards. You can fight this, but you'll be racking up fees and penalties every day you refuse to comply. It's best to just accept reality and work with us. I let out a bitter laugh. Reality? Lady, the reality is that you're trespassing on my land and trying to enforce rules that don't apply to me. The officer, still holding my deed, hesitated. I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced by Karen's nonsense. But then, another officer spoke up. Look, sir, until this matter is sorted legally, we can't let you proceed. It's best if you take it up with the HOA board. I clenched my jaw. This is unbelievable. They were actually trying to block me from entering my own property based on HOA nonsense that had no legal standing. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to back down. They wanted to play legal games. Fine. I knew the law better than they did. The setup for revenge. I turned to Karen, forcing a smile. All right. You want to do this the official way. Let's do it. She smirked, thinking she had won. I'm glad we're on the same page. I walked back to my truck, pulled out my phone, and started recording. You're saying, on record, that you are blocking access to my legally owned property based on HOA rules that don't apply to me. Karen's smirk faltered for the first time. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. I continued, because if that's the case, I hope you and the HOA board have some good lawyers. You're violating property laws, restricting access without legal authority, and trespassing. Karen's face paled just slightly, but she recovered quickly. We're simply following procedure. I cut her off. You're violating my rights, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it. I stopped recording and dialed the number of my lawyer. Hey, John. I need you to get down here right now. The HOA just blocked my property entrance with the police. I'm going to need a legal hammer to smash this nonsense. Karen's smug expression was gone. The officers were shifting uncomfortably. And I knew, at that moment, that I had just flipped the script. The HOA's worst nightmare begins. I stood there, gripping my phone tightly, my heart pounding with a mix of frustration and determination. The sheer audacity of this woman and her HOA goons was enough to make any sane person lose their temper, but I knew better. Losing my cool would only give them the satisfaction of thinking they had the upper hand. I wasn't about to let that happen. The police officers shifted awkwardly, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation now that I had called in my lawyer. They had been content to let Karen dictate the rules up until that moment, but now that they realized they might actually be in legal trouble for enforcing non-existent HOA authority, their confidence wavered. I could see it in their eyes. The hesitation, the second-guessing. Karen, on the other hand, had the expression of someone who had never been challenged before, someone who was so used to getting her way that the very idea of resistance was foreign to her. She folded her arms, tilting her chin upward as if trying to remind herself that she was still in control. But I knew better. I had seen it 100 times before. The false bravado of someone who had overplayed their hand. You can call your lawyer if you like, she finally said, her voice dripping with condescension. But I can assure you, Mr. Turner, that the Greenwood Estates HOA is fully within its rights to enforce compliance with community regulations. If you want to challenge that, you're welcome to take it to the HOA board for review. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh, believe me, I'm not taking this to your little HOA board. I'm taking this straight to court. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a smug smile. You're free to do that, of course. But legal battles take time and money, and in the meantime, your access to this road remains restricted. I suggest you comply with our regulations while you sort things out legally. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. I could feel the rage simmering just beneath the surface, but I wasn't going to let her be the one to control the narrative. Instead, I turned to the police officers. Just so we're clear, you are enforcing this restriction based solely on the HOA's word, correct? You have no legal documents, no court order, nothing that actually gives them the right to block access to my land. The older officer sighed heavily, clearly regretting ever getting involved in this mess. Look, sir, we're just here to make sure there's no disturbance. The HOA claims they have the authority to regulate access, and we're following up on that claim. So, you're acting on an assumption rather than legal fact, I said, my voice firm. Because I have my property deed right here, which proves that the HOA has zero jurisdiction over my land. And yet you're allowing them to block my entrance. Are you aware of what that means? I saw it click in his mind, the realization that if I sued, this could come back to bite them. The police officers exchanged glances before the older one stepped away to make a phone call. Karen's smile tightened, but she wasn't ready to back down just yet. You're making this far more difficult than it needs to be, Mr. Turner, she said, her voice laced with irritation. This could be so much easier if you just worked with us. I narrowed my eyes. And by worked with you, you mean give in, start paying HOA fees, and let you dictate what I can and can't do on land I own. She shrugged as if that was the most reasonable thing in the world. Every community needs structure. We simply want to ensure that the area maintains its aesthetic and property values. I took another step toward her, lowering my voice so only she could hear. You don't give a damn about aesthetic or property values. This is about control. You thought you could push me around like the rest of the people in your neighborhood. But let me tell you something, lady. You picked the wrong damn person to mess with. The smirk she had been wearing faltered. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. The legal hammer comes down. 20 minutes later, my lawyer, John Reynolds, arrived. He was an older man, sharp as a tack and meaner than a junkyard dog when it came to legal disputes. He took one look at the scene. The HOA blocking my entrance, the cops standing around awkwardly, Karen looking smug, and shook his head. Jesus Christ, Jake, he muttered. I knew you'd find yourself in some ridiculous situation, but this takes the cake. I smirked. Yeah, well, welcome to my morning. John turned to the officers first. Gentlemen, are you actually enforcing this blockade? The older officer, clearly weary of the entire situation, shook his head. We were called here under the assumption that this was an HOA dispute. We're not enforcing anything until we get legal confirmation. John nodded, then turned his attention to Karen. Now let's talk about what you're doing here. Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like trespassing and illegal obstruction of private property. Karen straightened her shoulders. We are well within our rights to regulate access within the Greenwood Estates community. John pulled out a folder, flipping it open. Really? Because according to official county records, this property was never included in Greenwood Estates boundaries. It was legally established as independent farmland, meaning your HOA rules hold about as much weight here as a piece of wet tissue paper. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. I could practically see the gears in her head turning as she tried to come up with an excuse. John wasn't done. Furthermore, by blocking access to Mr. Turner's property, you have engaged in an act of unlawful detainment, which is punishable under state law. I could have you personally arrested right now, and I'd be well within my rights to do so. The blood drained from Karen's face. The officers were no longer just standing around. They were listening, and they didn't look pleased. John continued, his voice calm but firm. Here's what's going to happen. You are going to remove every single HOA barrier blocking my client's property. You are going to leave this land and never attempt to claim jurisdiction over it again. And if you ever try to enforce HOA rules here again, I will personally see to it that you are sued for everything you have. The silence was glorious. Karen swallowed hard, her hands clenched at her sides. You're making a mistake, she hissed. John raised an eyebrow. No, you made a mistake. And now you're going to pay for it. The officers turned to Karen. Ma'am, I think it's best if you comply. With no other choice, Karen reluctantly ordered her people to move the cars. The moment my entrance was cleared, I crossed my arms and smirked. "Next time," I said, "maybe check your legal standing before you try pulling this crap." Karen shot me a venomous glare, but she knew she had lost. As her little HOA army retreated, I turned to John. "Well, that was fun," I said sarcastically. John shook his head. "Jake, this isn't over. I suggest we hit them before they try anything else." I grinned. "Oh, don't worry. I have plans." The HOA strikes back and falls hard. The satisfaction of watching Karen and her self-important HOA army retreat from my property was something I would cherish for a long time. However, I wasn't naive enough to think this was the end of it. People like her didn't accept defeat gracefully. They stewed on it, obsessed over it, and eventually came back with an even more desperate and underhanded plan. I knew Karen wasn't going to give up just because my lawyer had smacked her down in front of the police. If anything, this loss would only make her more determined to win. And I was right. It started just 2 days later. That morning, I stepped out onto my front porch with my usual cup of coffee, breathing in the fresh air of my farm. The land was quiet, peaceful, exactly how I liked it. But as I glanced toward the road leading to my property, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A large red sign had been placed at my entrance. HOA under REVYU. Restricted access by order of Greenwood Estates HOA. I nearly choked on my coffee. For a second, I just stared at it, blinking, unable to comprehend the sheer stupidity of what I was looking at. Then I laughed, a full, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, Karen, you really don't know when to quit, do you?" I stormed down the driveway, my boots crunching against the gravel, and examined the sign. It was professionally printed, big and obnoxious, designed to look official even though it was absolute nonsense. But what really set me off wasn't just the sign. It was the new padlock attached to my gate. Karen had locked me inside my own property. For a few seconds, I debated simply cutting the damn thing off with a pair of bolt cutters and moving on with my life. But then I stopped. No, I wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an escalation. She wasn't just trying to bully me into compliance anymore. She was actively interfering with my life and business. This was war. The HOA's biggest mistake yet. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of everything. The sign, the padlock, the gate. Then I did something I knew would rattle Karen to her core. I called the sheriff. Not the local police. The actual county sheriff's office. When the dispatcher answered, I kept my voice calm and professional. "Hello, I need to report an incident of illegal trespassing, property obstruction, and unlawful detainment on my farm. Someone has locked me inside my own property and is attempting to enforce regulations that do not legally apply here." The dispatcher took my information, and within 20 minutes, a sheriff's car pulled up outside my gate. The moment I saw Sheriff Roy Mercer step out of his vehicle, I knew this was going to go very badly for Karen. Roy had been sheriff in this county for over 25 years. He wasn't some young, easily manipulated officer who could be bullied by HOA nonsense. He was a no-nonsense, old-school lawman who didn't take kindly to people overstepping their authority. He took one look at the sign, then at the padlock, and let out a deep sigh. "Let me guess," he muttered, "HOA trouble." I smirked. Bingo. He rubbed his temples, already exhausted. Son of a... All right, who's responsible for this? Before I could answer, a familiar voice rang out from down the road. "Is there a problem, officer?" I turned, and there she was, Karen Whitmore, striding toward us in her usual blazer and oversized sunglasses, carrying a clipboard like it was a holy text. Sheriff Mercer's eyes narrowed as she approached. "You the one who put up this sign and locked this man inside his own property?" Karen barely even hesitated. As president of the Greenwood Estates HOA, I am enforcing community regulations as per our newly updated bylaws. Roy arched an eyebrow. Community regulations on his land. Karen smiled. All fake politeness. Mr. Turner's property falls within Greenwood Estates administrative oversight. While we understand that he has previously refused HOA membership, we are obligated to ensure that all properties within our community align with our standards. Until he submits his compliance paperwork, his property is under review and subject to HOA oversight. The sheriff just stared at her for a long moment, then turned to me. Jake, do you have your property deed on hand? I nodded, already pulling out the certified documents that proved my land was not part of the HOA. Sheriff Mercer scanned the papers, flipping through the pages, and then slowly turned back to Karen. Ma'am, do you have any legal documentation that proves this HOA has authority over his property? Karen hesitated. For the first time, I saw genuine uncertainty in her expression. She wasn't expecting to be challenged like this. She had probably assumed she could just bluff her way through this, like she always did. The community board recently voted to extend oversight to bordering properties, she said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. Roy nodded slowly. I see. And did you get county approval for that? Karen's mouth opened, then closed. The community board operates independently. That's a no then. The sheriff cut her off. Karen's lips thinned. The HOA has been regulating this neighborhood for years. We know what's best for the community. Roy took a step closer, towering over her. I don't give a damn what you think you know. What I do know is that you illegally locked this man inside his property. That's unlawful detainment. You also posted an unauthorized sign falsely claiming jurisdiction over private land. That's trespassing and fraudulent misrepresentation. You are in serious trouble, ma'am. Karen's face drained of color. I crossed my arms, enjoying every second of this. Roy continued, his voice firm. Here's what's going to happen. You are going to remove that padlock right now. You are going to take down that sign. And you are going to leave this man alone. If I get one more report about you harassing him, I will personally make sure that you are charged with criminal trespass and fraud. Do you understand me? Karen tried to sputter out a response, but all that came out was a weak, "You can't be serious." The sheriff just stared at her. After several long, tense seconds, she finally caved. She motioned for one of her HOA cronies, who had been standing behind her, wide-eyed, to unlock the padlock. As soon as my gate swung open, I let out a slow breath, savoring the victory. As the lock was removed and the sign taken down, Sheriff Mercer turned to me. Jake, if she or anyone from that HOA bothers you again, call me immediately. This nonsense stops today. I smirked. Oh, don't worry, Sheriff. I have plans to make sure this never happens again. Because I wasn't done with Karen yet. Not by a long shot. She had crossed the line for the last time. And now it was my turn to end the HOA's reign for good. The HOA's empire crumbles. Watching Karen fumble and stammer under the weight of Sheriff Mercer's authority was the highlight of my week. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to just give up and walk away. People like her, entitled, power-hungry, and completely detached from reality, didn't learn their lessons the easy way. No, she was going to stew on this, scheme in the dark corners of her HOA board meetings, and come back with something even more underhanded. But what she didn't realize was that I was already 3 steps ahead of her. The moment she had locked me inside my own farm, she had crossed a legal line so bold it might as well have been painted in neon. Trespassing, unlawful detainment, fraudulent misrepresentation. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was a full-blown legal war, and I was going to make sure Karen and her little dictatorship crumbled into dust. The very next morning, I met with my lawyer, John Reynolds. We sat in his office, a cluttered but cozy space, filled with law books and old case files. He had a smirk on his face as he flipped through the documents I had brought. My deed, the county property maps, the sheriff's official report from the day before, and most importantly, a compiled list of all the HOA's previous shady activities. John leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. "You weren't kidding, Jake. This woman's a walking lawsuit waiting to happen." I grinned, "And I intend to be the one to make that happen." He chuckled, but his eyes were serious. "All right, here's the game plan. First, we're going to file a civil lawsuit against Karen personally and against the HOA as an organization. We'll hit them for trespassing, illegal detainment, and property interference. But that's not the best part." He slid another document across the desk. I glanced at it, my eyes widening as I realized what he was proposing. "A cease and desist order?" I asked. John nodded. "Not just any cease and desist, a formal restraining order against Karen Whitmore and any HOA official from stepping foot on your property or attempting to enforce any rule on your land. If she so much as looks at your farm the wrong way after this is filed, she's looking at criminal charges." I let out a low whistle. "That's gonna hit her where it hurts." John smirked. "Oh, we're not done. After we get this filed, we'll take it a step further. I've done some digging, and it turns out your little HOA has been illegally collecting fees from homeowners under false pretenses for years. If we expose this, we're looking at a full-blown HOA collapse." I grinned. "Let's burn this empire to the ground." The HOA's unraveling begins. 2 days later, the papers were filed. A lawsuit, a restraining order, and a formal complaint to the County Housing Board regarding the HOA's shady financial activities. And as expected, Karen lost her mind. I was working in my barn when I heard the sound of car tires screeching outside my gate. I turned, wiping the sweat off my forehead, and saw Karen storming up the road, her high heels stabbing into the dirt like she was on a mission from hell. Her face was red with rage, and she was waving a folder of papers in the air. "What the hell is this, Turner?" she shrieked the moment she was close enough. I leaned against the barn door, crossing my arms. "Looks like legal paperwork. You should probably read it." She threw the folder onto the ground. "Yours SUING me." I smirked. "You locked me inside my own property, Karen. Did you think I was just going to let that slide?" Her hands clenched into fists. "You're going to regret this. Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with. And now so does the County Housing Board, the Sheriff's Department, and the State Legal Commission." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I gestured toward the papers lying on the ground. "By the way, you might want to read that last section. The restraining order kicks in immediately. That means you have exactly 5 seconds to get off my land before I call the sheriff again." I could see the moment reality crashed down on her. She took a shaky step back, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. "This isn't over," she spat. I smiled. "Oh, Karen, it's already over. You just don't know it yet." The HOA's financial fraud comes to light. As Karen stewed in her humiliation, things started falling apart for the HOA. First, the restraining order meant that she couldn't enforce any rules against me anymore. But the real nail in the coffin came 2 weeks later, when the County Housing Board launched an official investigation into Greenwood Estates HOA's financial activities. Turns out, John's research was right. For years, Karen and her HOA board had been illegally collecting fees from homeowners under false pretenses. They had overcharged residents for maintenance that was never done, misallocated funds, and even threatened homeowners with foreclosure if they didn't pay up. When the investigation results were made public, it was chaos. Residents who had been blindly following Karen's rule suddenly turned on her. Homeowners who had been forced to pay thousands in bogus fees were furious. People started filing their own lawsuits, demanding compensation for years of financial abuse. And then the final blow came. The County Housing Board issued an official order. Greenwood Estates HOA was to be dissolved permanently. The fall of Karen Whitmore. Karen tried everything to stop it. She held emergency meetings, tried to rally support, even attempted to bribe county officials to delay the process. But it was too late. The lawsuits, the financial fraud, the restraining order, it was all too much. When the final ruling came down, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, banned from serving on any future housing boards, and personally fined for her role in the financial misconduct. Her reputation was in ruins. The HOA was gone. And my farm, still standing strong, untouched, and finally free from harassment. As I stood at my gate that evening, watching the last remnants of the HOA crumble, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had thought she could control everything. She had thought she could bend the law, intimidate me, and take what wasn't hers. But in the end, she lost everything. And I got exactly what I wanted: justice, peace, and the sweetest victory of all. Aftermath and retribution. The downfall of the Greenwood Estates HOA was the talk of the town for weeks. Karen's once iron grip on the neighborhood had completely shattered. The homeowners she once lorded over with petty fines and absurd regulations now saw her for what she really was: a fraud and a bully. The news had spread far beyond our town. The local paper ran a full-page article about the scandal, exposing every underhanded tactic Karen had used to swindle money out of homeowners. People from neighboring communities were furious when they realized similar HOAs might be pulling the same scams. And Karen, she was finished. Her reputation was in tatters. The very people who once feared her were now laughing at her downfall. Her own neighbors shunned her. And to make matters even worse, her personal bank account took a major hit when the courts ruled that she had to personally repay some of the money she had wrongfully taken from homeowners. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't enjoying every second of it. But while Karen had suffered a personal loss, I wasn't quite done yet. I had spent months dealing with her harassment, and I was going to make sure she felt the weight of every second she wasted of my time. The legal cleanup begins. With the HOA officially dissolved, homeowners were now left wondering what happened to all the money they had been forced to pay over the years. Most of the homeowners just wanted their money back. But when we dug deeper, we realized that Karen hadn't just been taking excessive fees. She had been outright stealing. Some of the money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood upkeep had been funneled into Karen's personal expenses: new furniture, HOA funds; luxury vacations, HOA funds; expensive renovations to her already obnoxiously large house. You guessed it, HOA funds. Once this information came to light, the real legal trouble started. My lawyer, John, wasted no time in filing a formal criminal complaint against her. The local district attorney got involved, launching a criminal investigation into Karen's financial dealings. And as it turned out, this wasn't her first rodeo. She had a history of shady HOA dealings in other towns. She had jumped from neighborhood to neighborhood, taking over HOAs, squeezing homeowners for every dime they had, and then moving on before anyone caught on. But this time, she had pushed too far. And she had picked the wrong person to mess with. The final confrontation. One evening, about a month after the HOA collapsed, I was finishing up work in my barn when I heard a car pull up. I turned, wiping sweat off my forehead, and saw a familiar figure stepping out of a sleek black sedan. Karen. She looked different. Her usual arrogant posture was gone. There was no smug smile, no clipboard in hand, no self-importance oozing from her every movement. Instead, she looked worn down, exhausted, as if the last few weeks had taken every ounce of fight out of her. I leaned against the barn wall, crossing my arms as she approached. "Turner," she said, her voice unusually soft. I arched an eyebrow. "Karen, what brings you out here? You know you're not supposed to be on my property, right?" She hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. "I need to talk." I shrugged. "Talk, then." She took a deep breath. "You've made your point. The HOA is gone. I lost. Everyone in this town hates me. My life is ruined. Are you happy now?" I let out a short laugh. Karen, you did this to yourself. You stole from people. You tried to steal my land. You bullied, threatened, and harassed every homeowner in this town. And now you're upset because you're facing the consequences. Her hands clenched into fists. I made a few mistakes. I cut her off. No, Karen, you committed crimes. That's not a mistake. That's fraud. That's theft. That's abuse of power. You didn't just bend the rules. You broke the law. And now, the law is breaking you right back. She stared at me, her face pale and tight. For a moment, she looked like she was about to lash out. But then, something in her cracked. She let out a shaky breath and rubbed her temples. I need help. I blinked. Excuse me. She looked at me, pleading. You have connections. Lawyers. You have influence now. I need someone to make this go away. If you drop the charges, I'll make it worth your while. I still have savings. I can pay you. I stared at her in disbelief. You seriously think you can bribe me after everything you've done? She swallowed hard. Look, I was wrong. Okay. I admit it. But if I go to jail, my life is over. I sighed, shaking my head. Karen, your life was never yours to ruin alone. You dragged everyone else down with you. You destroyed families, stole money, and tried to take my land. The only thing you care about is yourself. She opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand to stop her. You want me to help you. Here's my advice. Get a damn lawyer, because I'm not stopping until I see this through to the end. Her face twisted with anger, but there was something else in her eyes now. Fear. Real, genuine fear. She knew there was no way out. Without another word, she turned and stalked back to her car. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, disappearing into the darkness. The final blow. Over the next few weeks, Karen's world completely fell apart. The criminal investigation uncovered even more fraudulent activity, including hidden bank accounts, laundered money, and off-the-books payments she had made to silence previous complaints. And then the final ruling came down. Karen was found guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and financial misconduct. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to every homeowner she had stolen from. The former HOA members who had blindly followed her were also hit with lawsuits, and many of them ended up paying hefty fines. As for me, I finally had my land back, my peace of mind, and the satisfaction of knowing that Karen Whitmore, the woman who had tried to control and manipulate everyone around her, was now behind bars, powerless and forgotten. The town eventually moved on. New leadership replaced the HOA. But this time, the homeowners made sure nothing like this would ever happen again. And Karen, the last I heard, she was mopping floors in a state prison, finally living under rules she couldn't control. The end of the nightmare. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun set over my now peaceful land, I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the last few months finally settle. Justice had been served. And for the first time in a long time, I was truly free. A new beginning and the final victory. Months passed since Karen Whitmore had been carted off to prison, and life in the town finally began to return to normal, or rather, better than it had been in years. The reign of the Greenwood Estates HOA was officially over, its corrupt roots ripped out from the ground. And in its place, a stronger, freer community had started to bloom. For the first time in years, homeowners weren't being harassed with ridiculous fines. The ridiculous restrictions on what people could and couldn't do on their own property had vanished. No more outrageous fees for neighborhood beautification projects that never actually happened, no more threats of foreclosure, and no more Karen dictating people's lives like she was some kind of suburban monarch. But what truly made it all worth it? It was the fact that I could finally live in peace on my farm without some clipboard-wielding HOA dictator trying to tell me what to do with land that had been in my family for generations. Still, I wasn't completely ready to close the book on the war I had waged against the HOA just yet. There was still one last loose end to tie up. And that loose end, making sure Karen never set foot near this town again. Karen's final attempt to escape justice. About 6 months after Karen had been convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison, I got a call from my lawyer, John Reynolds. "Jake," he said, his tone serious. "You sitting down?" I frowned, putting down my coffee. "What's up?" He sighed. "Karen's lawyers just filed an appeal." I nearly laughed. Appeal? For what? She stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from the community. She got caught red-handed. Yeah, well, apparently she's claiming that she was unfairly targeted and that the lawsuits were part of a personal vendetta against her, John said, irritation clear in his voice. She's trying to paint herself as the victim. That was classic Karen. Even after everything, after she had stolen from people, abused her power, committed outright fraud, and tried to illegally claim my land, she was still desperate to twist the narrative in her favor. "So what does this mean?" I asked. John sighed again. "Honestly, not much. The evidence against her is ironclad. Her financial records, the testimonies from the people she screwed over, the county investigation. There's no way the court overturns her conviction. But she's trying to buy time, delay the inevitable, and make herself look like the victim." I smirked. "That's fine, if she wants to play that game. Let's make sure she loses even harder." And that's exactly what we did, destroying Karen's last hope. The next few weeks were filled with legal back and forth, but it was clear from the start that Karen had no real case. The town's residents, the very people she had bullied and stolen from, weren't having it. The court was flooded with testimonies, letters, and statements from dozens of homeowners who had suffered under her rule. Some of them had lost thousands due to her corrupt fees. Some had nearly lost their homes. And some had been threatened just for questioning her authority. Then there was the sheriff's report, which detailed how Karen had illegally tried to seize my land, locked me inside my own property, and used the police to intimidate me. Her appeal was rejected in less than an hour. When the judge handed down the decision, he didn't just deny her request. He extended her financial restitution order, meaning she now had to pay even more money back to the homeowners she had wronged. Karen's last-ditch effort to escape justice had failed spectacularly. And to top it all off, the court placed a permanent restriction order on her, banning her from ever serving in any official HOA capacity again. That meant she could never do to another neighborhood what she had done to Greenwood Estates. She was finished, building something better. With Karen gone for good and the HOA disbanded, the town decided to take a different approach to managing the community. Instead of an HOA, a homeowners advisory committee was formed, one with no authority to impose fines or control people's property, but simply to help organize neighborhood events and assist homeowners when needed. For the first time in years, the town actually started thriving. People painted their houses whatever color they wanted. They put up fences without needing permission. Families could build tree houses in their backyards without fear of being fined. It was amazing how much happier everyone was without the oppressive weight of an overbearing HOA hanging over their heads. As for me, well, I got back to doing what I did best, running my farm, living my life, and enjoying my well-earned freedom. Without the HOA breathing down my neck, my farm actually expanded. I built a new barn, added a few more cattle to my herd, and even started hosting seasonal farm events for the community. Turns out, the very people Karen used to terrorize actually loved the idea of supporting a local farm. The same neighbors who had once feared HOA fines were now bringing their kids to my farm for pumpkin patches in the fall, hay rides in the summer, and fresh produce all year round. And the best part, the money I had won in my lawsuits against the HOA, I used it to help the homeowners who had been wronged. A couple of elderly folks who had been scammed into paying Karen's outrageous fees, I covered their losses. A single mother who had nearly lost her home because of HOA threats, I helped her pay off her mortgage. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about building something better. Karen's final fate. I never saw Karen again after her failed appeal, but every now and then I hear rumors. Some people said she moved to another state, trying to start over somewhere no one knew her name. Others said she was living with a relative, too broke to afford a place of her own. One guy even claimed she was working in a call center, forced to listen to complaints all day from angry customers, which, if true, was the perfect karmic punishment. But in the end, it didn't really matter. Karen was gone. The HOA was dead. And our town was free. The true victory. One evening, I sat on my porch, sipping a cold drink, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, the field stretched out before me, untouched by HOA nonsense, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Karen had tried to take everything from me. She had tried to steal my land, control my life, and break my will. But in the end, she was the one who lost everything. And me. I had won. Not just in court, not just against the HOA, but in life. And that was a victory worth celebrating.